All right, everybody. I am here with Alexander Mercouris, of course, the Oracle in London, and we have with us the great Robert Barnes. Mr. Barnes, where can people find you?
Best place to find me and any other sort of exclusive information and particularly content about that we're not supposed to talk about on YouTube and some other places is at vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
All right, so we will talk for maybe 10, 15 minutes on some international stuff that everyone will see on all our platforms, including YouTube. And then as we get into some more YouTube unsafe stuff, we'll move this over to Rumble and Locals and all of the free speech platforms. So, Robert, I am very, very interested, and I know Alexander is very interested to hear your thoughts on what's going on in the international scene with Biden, with Ukraine, with Russia. Is this a wag the dog moment for the Biden White House? Will this save his plummeting poll numbers, which, I mean, he's at 30 something percent, and that's generous. What is your take on what's going on with all of this stuff with Biden?
The timing of it all stinks of wag the dog inspiration. So you look at the trouble he got into in Afghanistan, and how did he try to get out of it? He tried to blow somebody up to say, "See, I saved the day," and instead he blew up the wrong family because it's Joe Biden. Then it gets into a wide range of trouble here in the States. In the 30s, the Fed is in an impossible conundrum where if they raise interest rates to lower inflation, may sink the stock market and sink the housing market. So they're caught in a catch-22, and the Biden administration is trying to pressure them to raise interest rates anyway because inflation is killing them, along with the domestic debacle of what Richard Barris, People's Pundit, and I talked about over a year ago, which is these COVID restrictions would not be popular over time. And that was a bad misread by the Biden administration, that the economy was not going to magically bounce back after stopping it for a year. Or the better part of a year, and of course it didn't. And so they had these fundamental assumptions about what would happen in their COVID policies that did not happen, and that you aggregate that up, as his poll numbers have sunk into oblivion, suddenly he needs to take out an ISIS leader. Suddenly he needs to escalate conflict with Ukraine, needs to change the agenda, change the topic of conversation, and look like a hero. Of course, this administration is so incompetent, it's going to make Jimmy Carter look like the most competent president in American history. First, they go out, this is their second sort of entanglement overseas, aside from everything that went wrong in Afghanistan. They try to take out an ISIS leader, hoping they get the same kind of credit that Obama got with, capturing and killing the Osama bin Laden, hoping to get the same momentum that Trump got from taking out the ISIS leader. But of course, he screwed it up again. The way it went about, ended up being women and children being dead. It's not clear if the execution was the original strategy, maybe been capture. Who knows? All it knows is the guy's dead, but maybe not necessarily at our hands. So it's just another debacle that the media had to drop because the deeper you dove into it is like this administration can't even kill an ISIS leader correctly. And then at the same time, all of a sudden there's going to be a war in Ukraine in any given minute. Russia's right about to invade, right about to invade, right about to invade. Ukraine's saying no, they're not. And the French are saying no, they're not. Germans are saying no, they're not. The Russians are saying no, we're not. But Biden keeps pretending it's going to happen because he needs to shift the agenda. He doesn't have an easy wag the dog moment, and he doesn't have an administration that's competent or capable to implement it. At least when Billy Boy did it, when he got into a little bit of trouble, even he, of course, ended up bombing milk factories, probably, or the wrong one in Somalia. But putting that one aside, his Balkans was good. In fact, it was right out of the movie. If you may not remember the movie Wag the Dog, written by the inimitable and inestimable David Mamet, is that they decide to fake a conflict in the Balkans in order to escape a sex scandal. And, it would be like Clinton with a wink and a nod does the exact same thing. And not only that, my favorite part was one of the things that would like in Wag the Dog was whether they got the weather right. Was when they were showing, well, of course, we were going to battle for refugees. That's the Wag the Dog's fight at the time. And I remember watching some of the imagery, and some of the imagery they were broadcasting showed it snowing. And I was like, it's not even snowing in that part of the world right now. So I was like, it was like, you got to at least, make sure the script is on weather cue. But Clinton knew how to do that a little bit better. And some past presidents knew how to do that a little bit better. But Biden just can't even do a Wag the Dog moment right without it backfiring.
Absolutely, because of course
What are your thoughts? The worst communications department in history is what I call
It's the
them.
worst communications department in history. And I have to say that, again, I do wonder how completely out of touch these people are. Firstly, I mean, the point about a wag the dog operation is that it depends very much on your ability to control every aspect of it. So, if you're dealing with, the Yugoslav Serbia, well, it's a tough little country, but it's a little country. You can control them. It's not difficult to get a coalition together because nobody's really going to be particularly affected by it. I mean, the Germans don't have any particular skin in that game. The British don't, the French don't. They can all join in the fun, and of course it's fine. But Russia? Take on Russia, nuclear superpower, one that, holds Europe, over a pipeline. I mean, it's already going to create problems. And of course, you're dealing with, to be straightforward about it, very sophisticated people in Moscow. I mean, they may be there may be lots of things, but they are not easy people to manipulate and control in that kind of way. And of course, Ukraine itself has its own ideas, which isn't particularly on message either, because the Ukrainians say, why should we have a war in which we're all going to be obliterated to save Biden's poll ratings? So, I mean, it's an impossible one to control in that kind of a way. So the result is, and we're now starting to get pushback, at least so it seems to me, we're starting to see people beginning to say, well, you've been talking about this war and about this war being imminent. Well, where is this war? When's it going to start? When's it going to happen? When are we going to see something, like what you're talking about? And they've now got into this situation where they're not getting their wall. And they're not getting their win either, because they need some kind of climb down by Putin to make it look like, Biden is the new JFK. But Putin isn't providing it. He's not even talking very much. He has meetings with the French. He has meetings with the Hungarians. He doesn't really say very much. And why should he back down? What has he got to back down over? He's not threatening anybody. So the result is this thing is becoming drawn out. It's becoming protracted, and they're in danger of losing the narrative. And you saw that with that business with Matt Lee, and in the State Department, saying, this story about, the false flag affair. What's your evidence? Well, we are the evidence, exactly. We are the evidence. And already you're starting to see even some of the sort of tame journalists in Britain now, like Simon Tisdall, are saying, this story about a war has been oversold. There isn't going to be one. And only this morning, I was reading in the Financial Times, little paragraph squirreled away that, some people in Washington and in some European capitals are now becoming concerned that after all this machinery has been put in place, all this talk about sanctions and, pressure and whatever, this situation isn't resolving itself, and nothing concrete seems to be changing. So it's a wag the dog moment, which hasn't been thought through properly, because they're not able to control the narrative in the way that Bill Clinton was able to control the narrative when he blew up, pharmaceutical factories in Sudan, or bombed Yugoslavia, or did those sort of things. He's just playing in a league that's too big for that sort of thing. He's trying to be Kennedy against Khrushchev. And, he's not Kennedy. And Putin isn't Khrushchev. And, well, manufacturing a fake version of that just doesn't cut the mustard, as we say.
Going off of that, Robert, I think Alexander brings a really interesting point about dealing with Putin. And, in the media, we get a lot of cartoonish characterizations about Putin. Whatever your feeling is about Putin, as a lawyer, he's a lawyer, you're a lawyer, Alexander's a lawyer. I think you guys could provide some good insight as to what exactly the Biden White House is dealing with when they're dealing with someone like Putin, and the way Putin thinks, the way he stays on message, the way they're negotiating as well. Because the media presents it as this good evil thing, as this Putin's a dictator and a thug. But when you go beyond that, you're dealing with a very intelligent man who has a legal background and thinks with a legal mind. And I think that's how he's approaching this crisis, these negotiations, these security guarantees, etc. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that as two lawyers, in this video. Yeah.
Can I just start on this?
Alexander?
Because the point about Putin as a lawyer is one that is not, I think, well understood. We've all heard about Putin as the KGB agent, which of course he was. He worked for the KGB. But I don't think people have ever really understood what his role in the KGB was. He was not a field agent. He didn't run spies, and he wasn't a secret policeman. What he was, he trained as a lawyer in St. Petersburg University and was employed within the KGB as what the Soviets used to call a jurisconsult. In other words, he was a legal officer in the back office of the KGB operation in Dresden. In other words, he is a trained lawyer. He has a legal background, and that is his approach, and it's very much reflected in the way that he runs things. But of course, he's not just one person, and this is the other thing which I think the West so much gets wrong. He works within an extremely structured process. So you have the Security Council, which meets every week in Moscow, which is his top body, which he consults and where all the important people are. You could call it the Politburo, if you like, because apparently it meets in the same room as the former Politburo used to do. It has many of the same kind of features about it. It's very structured, and there's a whole secretariat that prepares things for him. There's a legal department, obviously, that works. So it's a very structured, very deliberative government. It's not one man, however clever, however brilliant, making decisions by himself. Russia just doesn't work like that. That's not how Russia works. Sometimes that's a good thing, by the way. Sometimes it's a bad thing. Sometimes things are slow. It makes things slow, but it's structured. And the result is that because it's structured in that kind of fashion, it may not always be particularly proactive, but, and this is, I think, something which perhaps Robert will understand, it works in some ways like a very well-organized casino. You can come along, you can win against it sometimes, but over time, it gradually pulls back and plays you out. And that's what Russia is like. It's like if, I think Robert has worked with Russians and, negotiated with them. That's very much the sort of Russian style. And Putin's government is no different, or so it seems to me. And I think that if you're a well-organized US administration, and we've had very well-organized US administrations in the past, Ronald Reagan's was in many respects. For example, going back in time, Nixon's had its weaknesses and its peculiar features, but, they had some clever people working there. You're a well-organized administration, you can work with that and you can take this on. If you're a chaotic bundle of absurdities in the way that this administration is, they will take you to the cleaners. You can't just come up with one clever idea and think that this is going to be enough. They will always come back. They will always probe. They will always come back with some new point. They will always stay on message. They will always hammer away at the legal points. The Astana Declaration, the Istanbul Declaration. There was one particular moment when I know that one of the US team was bringing up what happened in a negotiation in the late 60s in one of the treaties that was signed then, and what the Soviet delegation supposedly said. And within a very short time, the Soviets had the Russians had all the information from their archives. They were able to access all of that. They had it all prepared. So unless you are very well prepared and you know what you're doing, you're going to be outmatched. And I think that's the problem that we're seeing with this administration. It's just not organized enough. It's not just switched on enough to take this on.
Yeah. Robert, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a couple of fold. I mean, I recently did a hush hush at vivabarneslaw.locals.com, alternative histories, deep state figures, etc., on George Soros. And one of the points I made is that if you're going to understand someone, if you're going to defeat or overcome someone who you perceive as an adversary, you at least have to spend the time and effort to truly know them, to understand how they think, why they think the way they think, etc. Trump, to his credit, actually did spend time doing this. That's why he took differing approaches over time with the North Korean premier, and but for his terrible personnel hiring choices, we may have got a good deal there. That has never really been done with Putin in the West, amongst the sort of establishment elites, whatever you want to call it, whether deep state operators, infrastructure, whomever. The Biden administration, though, is particularly bad at it. And I always think whenever I think of Biden, I think of Biden fancies himself, and they want to pretend that Putin is some hybrid of Milosevic, having the limited power and influence of Milosevic, and how they were able to run over him in the Balkan conflicts, and Saddam Hussein, someone who brags a lot and thinks he's tough but can't win in the end, that kind of routine. And Putin doesn't fit anywhere close to either one of those people. Putin is someone rooted in the law. He's from St. Petersburg, means he's very kind of generally speaking, more Western oriented than, say, the average Russian, with a respect and understanding for the rules of diplomacy and the rules of law. And he's constantly and continuously appealing to those, as well as open debate. That he engages in much easier than Biden does, who's busy, cussing out reporters who ask him questions he doesn't like. And, whenever I think of Biden, I always think of what he said his mom said when he was young. And his mom said that, he liked to tell people that his mom said he was special and smart. And I was like, that's because you're not, Joe. That's why your mom had to keep saying that to you. But he fancies himself and likes to pretend that he is. Kyle Dunnigan does a great imitation of Biden that's just perfect these days, that you can find for comedic relief. But it's not so comedic when he's, dancing with the and causing potential conflict in a part of the world that's led to the last two world wars, and with a potential adversary that is a nuclear superpower. It's just mind-numbing what the strategy is. And I think that's why they continue. That's half the reason they continue to screw up in their engagement with Russia on Ukraine, and don't recognize that was never a wag the dog moment to begin with. That just had disaster tattooed all over it. If you can't even execute killing a Taliban leader or killing an ISIS leader correctly, what makes you think you're going to negotiate a Central European conflict that could trigger a world war? So it's just not the best. If I had been his advisors, and where my money was I thought they would pick an African country. Some say we're going to fix the problem of Rwanda, because that's what a lot of these sort of old, State Department West Wingers feel the most guilty about. There's a lot of things they should feel guilty about, but the only thing they really feel guilty about is Rwanda during the Clinton administration. Find another place that you could call Rwanda. And when the Ethiopian conflict started to flare up, I thought, that's perfect. There's even some people on each side of that conflict we've done previous business with. So, it's not like it would be that hard. It's just looking back through the Rolodex. And it's an exotic enough location and no big collateral risk if things go south or sideways, unlike the Ukrainian conflict. And you could build up the narrative to be very sympathetic, make it like make it a we're going to stop Rwanda part 2. And if he had smarter or savvier people, and that reaches the second problem of this administration, it's a chaos administration. It's an administration in conflict. Biden is mostly a figurehead, doesn't get into the details, doesn't understand the consequences. It's not clear how cognizant he even is. Kamala Harris is hated, so that's not an alternative power source. And the State Department and the defense can't agree with one another about a wide range of topics and subjects, and the intelligence apparatus either. And then you got people at the top of the military infrastructure that are probably the least prepared military people in our history. People are more concerned about reading about white fragility and, wokesterism, and making sure that members of the military are forced to forfeit their religious beliefs for an experimental vaccine, than they are focused on actually having a prepared and ready military for any conflict in the world. as could flare up at any time, especially with this administration. So we have the worst of both worlds. We have Carter-level ineptitude, just waiting for the helicopters to crash in the desert, trying a failed rescue mission after making the mistake of saying, it's okay if Khomeini goes back to Iran. Probably won't be a problem. He might even be some of the State Department internal cables where maybe he would be even a force for democratic good. How did that turn out? With a degree of chaotic incompetence I don't know we've ever had. At times, LBJ's administration had some deep internal conflict, but nothing like this. And that's what makes it scarier, is that we have not only people whose moral compass is broken, but people whose capabilities are deeply constricted. And you combine the two, and that's how you get disaster.
Absolutely.
That's really interesting.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Completely with that. Absolutely.
No, I think it's really interesting, Robert, that you say that. I thought when Biden was going to be president, given the history with Ukraine and his family's history with Ukraine, an embarrassing history that was covered up by social media and the mainstream media, I thought they would never touch Ukraine because I thought they want to keep the skeletons hidden in Ukraine. But I guess you could say they went back to what they were familiar with in a way. I mean, I don't know how to explain it. I thought personally, they're not going to go to Ukraine because a lot of stuff's just going to get dug up. But I don't know, maybe they just went with what they were comfortable with.
I think it's half of it, plus both the Clinton side and the Biden side, or the corrupt side of the political establishment, has never forgiven Putin for taking away. I mean, Ukraine was a small ATM for the democratic political machine and the corrupt actors in the West. Russia was supposed to be the grand ATM, and it was during large parts of the 90s. And basically, Putin shut it down, and they've been bitter about it ever since. I mean, there's other reasons that they're politically afoot, but in a sort of, it's like an old British Empire colonial mindset towards the end of the colonial empire. Like we were talking to an Indian doctor that was from Canada on the COVID issues on Rumble, Viva and I, yesterday. But, he went through all of the screw-ups that the British made in India. He was like, it wasn't just, disliking their rule and their colonial, is that they were incompetent, particularly in the last century of their rule. They were doing things where people were like, why? You're shutting down this industry for no apparent profitable purpose for you. And you read about dying empires, and they tend to have idiots. It's kind of like, it's what Thomas Paine's argument was against the right of kings and queens to rule. He's like, have you studied, how these people are born? Do you really think these people are God's choice to rule us? And it was one of the brilliant rhetorical effects in the taverns and bars of the colonial era that helped precipitate the American Revolution. The same is true. You just meet these people. It's like so many of them are from Yale, as just in the Ivy League. When I was at Yale, I was like, these people shouldn't rule anybody, anytime, anywhere near. These people are terrifying. Give me any plumber. Give me any guy off the street. Goes back to William F. Buckley. I would rather have anybody out of the phone book than anybody from Harvard rule me. And it's true, but it's more true now than it was then. These people are not just, they have Kissinger's moral compass combined with Carter's level of incompetence. And that's not a good marriage.
No, that's actually
Alexander, your thoughts, and Alexander, your thoughts, and I also would like you to segue, since we're talking about incompetent rulers, segue into the mandates and Trudeau, and let's talk about that as well. So I leave it up to you, Alexander.
Absolutely,
comment on what Robert said, and then let's segue into the most. At this moment, the most incompetent, the poster boy of incompetent.
Indeed. Well, can I just say, I mean, what Robert said about declining empires and the level of incompetence suddenly grows. It's absolutely right. Of course, I live in Britain, and I'm British Empire and all of that. I know that extremely well. And what you have with the British Empire, when it's sort of established in the 18th century, you have incredibly ruthless, piratical, brilliant people. Clyde, Wolfe, they're going around, they're winning battles, they're doing sometimes terrible things, but nobody can dispute their energy and their drive and their intelligence and their absolute ruthlessness. And then what then happens sometime around the middle of the 19th century is that all those people are replaced by the products of the public schools, the people who are the younger sons of the aristocracy, who, what do we do? We find them a nice cushy blot job in, Maharashtra state in India, or pack them off to Nigeria, or what was then what we now call Nigeria, and they're put in charge and they run things there, and they got no real understanding of these things. But of course, the British Empire became basically a job agency for the incompetent younger sons of the British aristocracy who went to these places. And of course, it was well understood that part of the purpose that they were sent there was in order to enrich themselves. There was an awful lot of corruption about it. And it seems to me that you're getting an awful lot of what we see today, according to what Robert was saying. That again, the people who built up US power were men of dynamism, energy, intelligence, ruthlessness. But what we now have today is, Jake Sullivan and people of that kind. People who are, frankly, they couldn't, as we say, fight their way out of a paper bag with all the corruption and incompetence that we saw with, the events in Ukraine. So, it seems to me that we have this. And by the way, I remember there was a program, a sort of parodic program that we did in Britain about the last imperial governor of a particular fictional African country. And suffice to say that his name, this is a program, was Sir Complete Idiot. So it's that kind of decline that we saw in Britain. And I hope it doesn't come to that in the US. And of course, the US is a much bigger country and it's much more dynamism and energy. And I think ultimately a lot more reserves of intelligence, dare I say. But it does need to rid itself of all of this and put these terrible people in their box, if I can just say that. But the problem is, that's the other thing that happened in Britain, and it explains so much about British decline, because you send all these younger sons out, they're incompetent, but they become rich, they become powerful, they bring back their ideas back home, they start running Britain itself in very much the same kind of way that they used to run their colonies. They have an authoritarian drive. Britain used to be an extremely anarchically liberal place. And there's a very famous statement that was once made in the House of Lords when Gladstone wanted to impose restrictions on alcohol consumption. And somebody in the House of Lords got up and said, I would rather see... I want to see Britain. I would rather see Britain free than Britain sober, for example. That was very much the internal British tradition. But you got all of this authoritarianism and incompetence brought in from the empire, and it was imported back home, and many of its methods started to take hold here. And I think you've seen the same in the United States to a terrible extent. Except, as I said, I think the democratic antibodies in America are much stronger. But that is exactly what has led us to some of the things that we're seeing in the United States today. These attempts to impose all these extraordinary restrictions, to govern without law, which for me is an abomination. I really can't express how strongly I feel about that. Having lived when I was young in Greece in a country where legal order had to a great extent broken down, and you see all of that being brought back home. You see the intelligence services involving themselves in the political process at home, and of course, it directly leads us to this corruption of law, this abuse of law. And these mandates, these restrictions, all of these things that we have seen in the United States today. The empire and the problems within the United States are intimately interconnected. And the one also explains why the political class in the United States has declined in the way that it has. If you have a true republic based on the Constitution, under the rule of law, in which people exercise democracy freely, then the kind of political class that we have seen emerge in the United States is impossible.
Well, yeah, and you could argue that you could extend that throughout the Western English-speaking empire. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United Kingdom. This combination of, to take Canada as an example, what happens when you sort of have you inherit the authoritarianism of Castro, who some joke, some not so joking, say might be the real papa for Mr. Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, the prime minister, but without his competence, right? I mean, Castro, whatever you may criticize him for, was able to succeed in dominating a country long after anyone thought he could or would. But part of that was an authoritarian ruthlessness, and it's like his bastard kid has picked up the authoritarianism without the intelligence. When you have to get to the point where you're now the most memeable, it looked like Joe Biden was going to be the most memeable, but now Trudeau is the most memeable. Him sitting in his pajamas saying, if I wasn't sick, I'd go out and talk to those truckers, right, mommy? It's so easy. The guy's a crock. He's an embarrassment. When ordinary truckers, they show up and they ask truckers who reverse the media script after all these years, been extensively covered by Viva Fry. People can find it. He went down and interviewed them all live 4 or 5 hours a day for day after day after day to show the media narrative about these guys was totally false. Despite the attempts to do clear false flag events, people show up with Confederate flags and Nazi flags and then quickly disappear just long enough for the photo shot, often wearing masks so you can't identify them. This was obvious. Homeless are getting the best food they've gotten in years in Canada, thanks to the truckers. Crime has gone down in sections of Ottawa that have had crime problems, thanks to the truckers. They're not, aside from honking horns, they're not disrupting anything. They're disrupting it just enough in the Gandhi style, with the honking and occupation, to draw the world's attention, but not doing so in a manner that's threatening in any meaningful manner to the local population, only to Trudeau's self-perception. And, first he has to pretend that he had positive tests. Then he says, no, now he had a test, but not positive, but he was around people. Then all of a sudden he tested positive. Then nobody knew where he was. Now he finally shows back up and he wants to attack a bunch of truckers. The Teamsters Union in the United States was led by Jimmy Hoffa, the strongest pro-labor union in the history of the country, and the most successful union in the history of the country. And truckers are that way. They're very independent. They're very strong. They see the world. They're no nonsense. That's why they're able to reverse the media script so often. When people asked him, when are you going to leave? And they said, well, we figured 2 weeks to flatten the curve. That kind of routine. Or somebody screaming at them about the honking, and they say, the honking will continue until freedom returns. In the same way people said, the mandates will continue until compliance comes about. Just flipping the media script over and over and over. To the degree the media has to have 5 different stories. First, there is no convoy. Well, yeah, there is a convoy, but it's not about the mandate. Oh, well, yeah, it is a convoy, but it's real small of just fringe people. And then actually, it's a scary, dangerous convoy that's like January 6th insurrections and riots. And as each narrative fell, they've just proven, they haven't just cried wolf 3 times. They've cried wolf like a half dozen times, and the world can see it. And all of a sudden, Alberta is switching. Other provinces are switching. Quebec's attempts to tax people based on their medical status has to reverse it. And you're seeing large parts of the whole Western world realize that people are exhausted with these mandates and restrictions and lockdowns and limitations that have never worked through history, didn't work this time. And as the adverse effects of it are being felt more and more and more, whether it's from the mandatory drugs, vaccines, or whether it's from the economic effects and social effects, or it's 3-year-olds, getting their language skills developed, underdeveloped, because a bunch of kids are wearing masks who have no business wearing masks, and underestimating the importance of facial interaction for young children and learning social communication skills. It's just group after group after group they've lost, to where all they have left are the sort of ex-colonial statists who don't understand how unpopular their position is. And the last guy, I guess, that last man standing in this may end up being Justin Trudeau, to his ultimate detriment.